If Tristram Shandy, David Copperfield, and Jane Eyre had a threesome, and from that unholy union came forth a book, would you want to read it? If so, then you should read Middlemarch by George Eliot. And before we get to the review, we're going to answer one question. Did I enjoy reading the book? And the answer is yes. Welcome to Whiskey and Literature, where we read and discuss the greatest books of all time. And while we're turning those pages, we're sipping those bottles, those finely distilled spirits. I'm your host, Captain Mike, and I'm reading and reviewing 52 books in 52 weeks in 2023. This is my 16th book review of the year so far, Middlemarch by George Eliot. And before we get to the book, let's talk about the author. Mary Ann Evans, like many female authors in the 19th century, used a pen name, George Eliot. Unlike most of these authors, for some reason her name is stuck. She was born in 1819 and passed away in 1880. I thought it was kind of interesting that her parents thought that because of her plain looks, she wouldn't have a good chance of getting married. And so she was afforded an education that most women in her day didn't get. She worked as an editor for a journal, and a lot of her articles were supportive of the lower classes and critical of organized religion. She worked as a translator quite often, and she translated some German works specifically that were questioning the literal truth of the Bible. And despite her parents' concerns, she did have a long-term relationship with a philosopher and a critic until his passing away. They were never married, but they were together for a very long time, and that was kind of unusual for that day and age. And after he passed away, she did actually get married to, get this, a guy who was 21 years her junior. And I found this was crazy interesting. During the honeymoon, he tried to commit suicide. So, how badly was that going? And before we get to the book, we're going to talk about the whiskey of the week briefly. Pendleton Rye, aged 12 years. I haven't opened it yet. I'm super excited to do so. So the Wednesday after this book review drops on YouTube, you'll see this whiskey review drop as well. And the link will be in the description below. Okay, now let's talk about the specs and the stats for Middlemarch. This was released in 8 volumes between 1871 and 1872, and it's a historical novel. It originally was 2 separate works, Middlemarch and The Life of Miss Brooke, and George Eliot, she combined it into one book. Initial reviews for Middlemarch were kind of mixed, but now it's considered George Eliot's best book and one of the great English novels. I read some of the copy that I have, 688 pages long, but I did mostly listen to it on Audible, and Maureen O'Brien was the narrator, and that was a really nice job that she did. Pretty long listen, 32 hours and 23 minutes. Okay, now let's talk about the plot, the structure, and the characters of Middlemarch. This is a hugely complex book with multiple, say 4 or 5 storylines that interweave amongst themselves within the fictional town of Middlemarch. We spend the majority of the time with 2 of them, the Lydgate and the Dorothea threads. Lydgate was the main character of Middlemarch until the short story Miss Brooke was interwoven, and he had to share the stage with Dorothea. And we're just going to talk about the Dorothea thread in this review, otherwise it would be too unwieldy and long. We start the book at Mr. Brooke's estate, and he is a wealthy landowner who has as his wards his 2 orphaned nieces, 19-year-old Dorothea and her younger sister Celia. In this 19th century, if you were a wealthy landowner, you had on your property tenants who lived there, and you would build them cottages, and they would pay you rent and either work on your estate or they would have a trade that they plied. Dorothea was very pious and concerned about the lower class, and she spent quite a bit of time devising ways to make their lives better. She was the creme de la creme of Middlemarch society. Beautiful, educated, pious. All the girls wanted to be her. When the book begins, Dorothea is being courted by a neighboring landowner, but she is fairly oblivious to him and instead falls in love with Reverend Casaubon, a scholar who is 45 years old. She feels she will be able to help him in his research, but on their honeymoon, she realizes how little interest her husband has in involving her in his work. While they are in Rome, she meets Will Ladislaw, her husband's much younger cousin, who immediately falls in love with her. And while they do remain friends, she is fairly oblivious to his feelings. However, her husband Casaubon, he is not oblivious to these feelings and tries to keep them separated, which of course doesn't work. And while Dorothea realizes she does have feelings for Will Ladislaw, she remains faithful to her husband until he dies. The Reverend had put a spiteful amendment into his will that if Dorothea married Will Ladislaw, she would forfeit the lands and the funds left to her. Will tries to be a man and doesn't ask Dorothea to give up her position to marry him. But Dorothea finally realizes that love is greater than land and money, and they do get married and live happily ever after. And that, in a very brief summary, is the Dorothea storyline, the thread. All the storylines in Middlemarch, they have connections, and maybe we're talking about one of the other characters and she's talking to someone and they're in town and they see Dorothea walk by and they mention that, and I like those connections. It's a really nice touch in the book. The full title of the book is Middlemarch, a study of provincial life. Themes include marriage, most of them being dysfunctional, including both of Dorothea's. Medical practices. Lydgate is a young doctor, and he is trying to move the medical profession towards more modern practices. Politics and class. This story was written just about 40 years after the Great Reform Act of 1832 was passed. And in the story, that was a concern for all of the characters, as the lower class was looking forward to gaining a voice in the political system, and the landowners were fearing losing influence. Innovation versus entrenchment. The coming railroad was a big deal, and it symbolized change and progress. Hypocrisy and religion, symbolized by Mr. Bulstrode. Women and their place and voice. Okay, so what are my thoughts on Middlemarch by George Eliot? This is a big, complicated story, but it's fairly straightforward and kind of easy to read. I was rarely moved by this book, and some of the characters I didn't much care for, and when we were talking about them, I just couldn't wait to get back to the characters that I actually enjoyed and liked. I think it's hurt overall by having so many characters. There's not time enough spent on one so much that you actually care. She did an excellent job with the language and the description of people, places, and things. Not so tedious as Tolstoy and Tolkien, but just enough that we had a real flavor of the setting. I really appreciated the dashes of humor in the book, almost exclusively when the women were talking about how they really feel about the men. Overall, I enjoyed Middlemarch, but I don't think I'm going to be reading any more of George Eliot's books. Okay guys, time for the star rating. And I'm judging all my books now on 5 criteria. 6 if I listen to it on Audible. So first is initial response. And how do I feel as soon as I finish the book? And I'm going to give Middlemarch a 3 because I was kind of glad when it was over. I liked it, but not in a kind of warm, fuzzy way. Recommendation. How likely am I to recommend Middlemarch? And I'm only going to give it a 2. I can't think of anybody that I know who would actually want to read this book. Style. Did I enjoy the writing style? And I'm going to give it a 5 because it was clear, concise writing with just enough snarky humor that I laughed occasionally. 4. Plot and structure. How engaged was I in the story? And I'm only going to give it a 3. It was a fairly straightforward story, but I could see a lot of what was coming a long ways off. 5. The characters. Were they relatable, believable, engaging? And again, I'm only going to give it a 3 because I felt like a lot of the characters were actually just caricatures. And I did listen to this on Audible, so it's going to get an Audible rating, and that specifically is just on the production, mainly just did it sound good and how was the narrator. And I'm going to give this a 4 for Audible because I thought Maureen O'Brien did a nice job. All right, guys, that's a 20. And 20 divided by 6 is 3.33. So 3.33 stars for Middlemarch by George Eliot. Okay, thanks for sticking with me. In the description below are the links to all my other book reviews that I've done this year so far. If you enjoyed the video, like it. It's free. Subscribe if you want to see more of my content. Guys, I hope you're reading something good and drinking something great. Turn those pages, my friends, and stay thirsty. Cheers.